Victoria Sterling grabbed the manual off the table and hurled it across the room. It hit Ethan Walker square in the chest. The entire boardroom went silent. Then she said it loud enough for every investor, every engineer, every suited executive to hear. Read the manual, fool. Maybe then you'll stop embarrassing yourself in front of people who actually built something. The room erupted in laughter. Ethan bent down, picked it up, opened the cover, and everything stopped. Because right there on the very first page was a name no one in that room expected to see. His name. Drop a comment with your city right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. You won't want to miss where this goes. The manual landed on Ethan Walker's chest with a flat, hard smack. Not the kind of sound that fades quickly. The kind that hangs in a room. The kind every person present feels somewhere behind their sternum, even if it wasn't their body that absorbed it. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't look at the floor the way a man does when he's deciding whether to swallow his pride or choke on it. He just stood there. The fluorescent lights above the Vanguard robotics demonstration floor buzzed the way they always did, that low, indifferent hum that doesn't care what happens beneath it. Around him, 43 people stood in expensive silence. Investors in tailored suits, government liaisons with laminated badges clipped to their breast pockets. Senior engineers who hadn't touched a wrench in a decade, but spoke about torque specifications the way a man talks about a wine he's never opened. And then there was Victoria Sterling. She stood at the head of the room with her arms crossed and her jaw set the way it always was when something had interrupted her timeline. Victoria Sterling did not tolerate interruptions. Not from systems. Not from subordinates. And certainly not from a 39-year-old warehouse technician in a faded gray work jacket who had the absolute nerve to raise his hand during the most important product demonstration in the company's history and say the words, "There's something wrong with the machine." She had looked at him the way people look at something they stepped on by accident. "Excuse me," she had said. Her voice was quiet. That particular kind of quiet that isn't soft at all. "The vibration pattern coming from the core assembly," Ethan said. He spoke steadily. Not fast, not defensive. Just the way a man speaks when he's certain. "It's irregular. The frequency is off by about 4 cycles per second from where it should be at this load. I noticed it about 3 minutes ago and it's getting worse, not better." The lead demonstration engineer, a man named Dale Hutchins, 52 years old, degrees from MIT and Stanford, a salary that would make Ethan's eyes water, had turned around with a smile that wasn't a smile. "The system has been through 87 calibration cycles," Dale said. "The diagnostics are clean." "I understand that," Ethan said. "But diagnostics don't always catch mechanical resonance buildup, especially when it's happening in the tertiary suspension joint rather than the primary drive. If you watch the left lateral arm, you'll see a micro-oscillation that—" "I'm sorry." Victoria's voice cut across the room like a blade through paper. "Who authorized this person to speak during the demonstration?" Nobody answered, because nobody had. She looked at Ethan the way people look at something that has appeared somewhere. It doesn't belong. Her eyes swept from his worn, steel-toed boots up to his work jacket, the one with the small embroidered Ethan on the left breast pocket. The letters slightly faded from 3 years of industrial washing, and her expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "What's your name?" she said. "Ethan Walker. I'm the overnight technician on the Floor 3 maintenance crew." "I've been servicing the Floor 3, she repeated. "Not a question, a categorization." Victor Hale stepped forward then. Victor always knew exactly when to step forward. It was perhaps the thing he was best at, reading the precise moment when stepping in would benefit Victor Hale the most. He wore a dark navy suit and a watch that cost more than Ethan's car, and he moved through rooms the way water moves around rocks, effortlessly, inevitably, without friction. "Victoria." Victor said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that said, "I've handled this already. Don't worry." Ethan used to work here in a limited capacity a few years back. He's one of our maintenance staff. I'm sure he means well. He glanced at Ethan with something that looked like sympathy, but wasn't. But the demonstration equipment has been certified by 3 independent engineering teams. We're good. The certification doesn't account for, Ethan started. You know what? Victoria turned to the table beside her, picked up the product manual, the thick spiral-bound document that contained every system specification, every protocol, every emergency procedure for Titan Rescue X, and held it out toward Ethan. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to make sure everyone was watching, she didn't hand it to him. She threw it through, not out of pure rage. Something more calculated than that. Something designed to make a point in front of an audience because Victoria Sterling understood better than almost anyone alive that perception is the currency that matters most in a room full of people writing checks. The manual hit Ethan's chest. He caught it before it fell. Read the manual, fool, she said clearly. Maybe then you'll stop embarrassing yourself in front of people who actually built something. The laughter that followed was not universal. A few people in the room didn't laugh, but the ones who did were loud enough to fill the space, and the ones who didn't were quiet enough that it didn't matter. In moments like this, silence is just a quieter form of participation. Ethan looked down at the manual in his hands. He turned it over once. Then he opened the cover. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It tapered the way laughter does when something unexpected interrupts it. One person stops, then another notices, and then the silence spreads like a cold front moving through the room. Because there on the inside cover, stamped in the original formatting of the document in font that hadn't been touched since the initial engineering submission 6 years ago, were 2 lines. Titan Rescue X. Primary Engineering Design Document. Original System Author Ethan J. Walker. Nobody moved. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't hold it up dramatically. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there with the manual open in his hands and let the words do what words do when they're true. He let them exist. Victor Hale's face did something complicated. The warmth dissolved first, then the confidence. What replaced them was something close to calculation, but underneath that, something older. Something that looked a lot like fear. Yeah. Ethan Walker had been waking up at 4:17 in the morning for the past 3 years. Not because his alarm was set for 4:17. Because his daughter Lily woke up at 4:15 with a nightmare approximately 4 times a week, and by the time he'd sat with her, talked her back to calm, checked that the hall light was on. The setting. She liked not too bright, not dark, and made it back to his own bed. There were only 13 minutes before his actual alarm went off at 4:30. And 13 minutes isn't sleep. It's just lying there in the dark, being aware that morning is coming. He'd learned to stop fighting it. He made coffee at 4:32, poured it into the blue thermos Lily had painted for him for Father's Day, the one with the crooked yellow star, and his name spelled Edan. Because she was 5, and the "the" sound had still been negotiating its terms, and he drove to Vanguard Robotics through streets that were still mostly dark. He'd been doing this since he was hired as an overnight maintenance technician 3 years ago. After the career implosion, after the termination, after the weeks of trying to find engineering work and discovering each time that his name had been quietly marked in ways that were never written down but always understood. The facility at 5 a.m. was his favorite version of it. No executives, no presentations, no one explaining to him in patient professional tones what he didn't understand about systems he had designed. Just machines. He walked the floor with the kind of attention that isn't taught in schools. It's the kind that develops in people who've spent enough time with mechanical systems to feel them rather than just read them, who know the way a doctor knows, before a test confirms it, that something is slightly off. The quality of a sound, the texture of a vibration, the way a component settles when it shouldn't. Titan Rescue X lived on the north end of the floor, under lights brighter than the rest of the facility, because the engineering team preferred working on it in full illumination. It was large, nearly 9 feet tall, in its deployed configuration, built to operate in collapsed structures, moving through debris fields to locate and extract trapped civilians. The project had consumed billions of dollars and 7 years of development, and in 2 days, it was going to be demonstrated before government procurement officials who had the authority to deploy it nationally. Ethan ran his hand along the left lateral arm housing. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. He stood still. He felt it. It was subtle, barely perceptible, something that wouldn't show up on most diagnostic dashboards because it wasn't in the primary systems. It was in the tertiary suspension joint, a component that connected the lateral extension arm to the main drive column. The vibration there was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not yet. But wrong in the way that things are wrong before they become catastrophically wrong, which is the only time you can actually stop them. He'd written about this in the original design document. The tertiary suspension joint was the system's most sensitive mechanical interface, the place where the arm's movement translated directly to the drive column's load management. Under standard conditions, it was more than adequate. But under emergency deployment loads, the kind of loads Titan Rescue X would experience when actually navigating debris and lifting structural weight, a resonance imbalance in that joint could cascade. He'd included an emergency monitoring protocol for exactly that scenario. He'd also included an override sequence embedded in the control firmware that would allow the operator to execute a controlled shutdown if the resonance reached critical threshold. The engineering team, as far as he could tell from the machine's current configuration, had removed the monitoring protocol, and he was fairly certain they'd overwritten the override. He stood there for a long time. The maintenance shift supervisor, a compact woman named Rosa, who had worked at Vanguard for 11 years and treated Ethan with the particular respect people give to those who are clearly overqualified for their current role without making a production of it, found him standing there when she did her 5:45 walkthrough. "You've been next to that thing for 40 minutes, she said. "There's a vibration in the tertiary suspension joint." Rosa looked at the machine, then at him. "Did you log it?" "I logged it at 5:20, flagged it priority 2. "Who's going to see a priority 2 flag at 5:20 the morning of a major demonstration?" "That's my concern." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, you know how this goes. The senior engineers are going to be here at 8, if you flag them directly. I tried that 6 weeks ago when I noticed the early resonance markers. The note got passed to Dale Hutchins. He sent me back a message that said the system had been certified and that maintenance staff should direct engineering observations through the appropriate submission forms." Rosa made the face people make when they know something is wrong and also know that fixing it is going to be someone else's problem. "Put everything in writing," she said finally. "Cover yourself." Ethan nodded. He already had. He'd been hired as a maintenance technician by a supervisor named Glenn, who had processed the application without knowing the name. Vanguard Robotics was large enough that the HR department and the engineering department existed in separate enough worlds that the connection between Ethan Walker, Floor 3 overnight technician, and Ethan Walker, the engineer whose career ended here 5 years ago, simply hadn't been made. Or it had been made, and someone had decided it didn't matter. A maintenance technician posed no threat. Men in work jackets with faded name tags are structurally invisible in corporate environments. They're the people who make sure the coffee machines work and the HVAC doesn't scream, and the air is the right temperature for the people doing the work that actually matters. Nobody studies them. Nobody worries about what they know. Ethan had understood this when he took the job. He'd taken it deliberately, because Titan Rescue X was here. And the thing that had been done to him was connected to Titan Rescue X. And if you want to understand what happened to something, to really understand it at the component level in the places where the truth actually lives, you have to be in the room where it is. He'd spent 3 years in that room. He'd read every modification report, every engineering revision, every certification document that passed through the facility. He had clearance to service the equipment, which meant he had physical access to the machine during overnight hours when the engineering team wasn't present. He'd compared what he was looking at to what he remembered designing, what he'd actually built. The document that existed on a server he still had access to, because Victor, in his thoroughness in erasing Ethan from the company's history, had neglected to check whether Ethan had created any external backup repositories before everything was deleted. Victor had made a significant number of assumptions about Ethan. He'd assumed Ethan was the kind of person who gives up. He'd assumed Ethan was the kind of person who walks away when the cost of staying gets high enough. He'd assumed Ethan was the kind of person who would rather rebuild somewhere else than come back and dismantle what had been done to him brick by brick over 3 years from a position where nobody was watching because nobody thought he mattered. Victor had been wrong about all of it. The meeting that unraveled Ethan's career had happened in a conference room on the 14th floor 5 years ago. He'd been the lead mechanical engineer on a program that didn't have a name yet, what would eventually become Titan Rescue X. The project was 2 years in, and Ethan had spent those 2 years building something he was genuinely proud of, which is a feeling engineers rarely discuss in professional settings. But that sits at the center of why most of them chose the work in the first place. The safety architecture he'd developed was by the assessment of the 3 external reviewers who'd evaluated it a genuine innovation, an approach to emergency system redundancy that hadn't been done before. Victor Hale had been his program partner. Victor handled the business side, the investor relationships, the procurement conversations, the government contract negotiations. Ethan handled the engineering. It was for 2 years a functional arrangement. Victor was good at what he did. He understood people. He understood what rooms want to hear, and he was very skilled at being the person delivering what those rooms wanted. What Victor was not good at was patience. He'd begun pushing about 18 months in to accelerate the testing timeline. Get to the demonstration faster. The investor presentations needed wins, and the wins needed to be visible, and the safest way to guarantee a visible win was to streamline the path to demonstration. Ethan had told him no, not aggressively, not personally. He'd walked Victor through the engineering rationale, the reasons why the safety validation timeline existed the way it did, the failure modes that the testing was designed to identify before they became demonstration day problems. He'd shown Victor the documentation. He'd been, by his own later assessment, maybe too calm about it, too confident that the technical reality of the situation would speak for itself. Victor had appeared to agree. What Victor had actually done was schedule a critical test for a period when Ethan was in the hospital. Lily's appendix had ruptured on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, she was in surgery. By Thursday, she was stable, recovering in a pediatric ward, and Ethan was sitting in a chair beside her bed watching her breathe with the focused attention of a man who has just been reminded of exactly what matters in his life. He'd gotten the call from the facility at 2 p.m. on Thursday. The test had failed. A safety system had not engaged properly. The robot had experienced a controlled but significant malfunction. Nobody was hurt, but the failure was real, and it was documented, and someone needed to be accountable for it. Victor had already spoken to Victoria Sterling by the time Ethan's call connected. The narrative was already set. The safety system that failed had been Ethan's design, which was technically true in the same way that a house fire is technically the fault of the wiring if you don't mention that someone removed the circuit breaker. Victor had modified the safety system during Ethan's absence. The modification had caused the failure. The documentation that would have shown this was already in the process of being revised. And Ethan, 3 days out of the hospital, exhausted in a way that goes down to the level of bone, was presented with a termination notice and a non-disclosure agreement. He'd signed the NDA. He'd done that for Lily, because Lily needed to eat and have a roof and sleep in a bed, and the NDA came with a severance package, and a man with a 6-year-old daughter and no job doesn't have the luxury of martyrdom. But he had not signed away the engineering documentation he'd already backed up. He had not signed away the original design files, the test specifications, the system architecture documents, the evidence of what Titan Rescue X actually was and who had actually built it. He'd kept those. He'd kept them for 5 years on an encrypted server, updated and organized and documented with the patient precision of a man who intends to use them exactly when the right moment arrives. The morning of the demonstration, Ethan arrived at 4:30 instead of his usual 5. He'd barely slept. Not because of anxiety, because Lily had had a nightmare at 2 a.m. Something about a dog and a broken fence, the specifics of which she couldn't clearly articulate, but which had required 20 minutes of back rubs and the yellow nightlight and the particular stuffed rabbit she only wanted when things felt scary. He'd sat with her until her breathing evened out, then made his coffee in the dark kitchen, poured it into the blue thermos with the crooked star, and left a note on the counter for his mother-in-law, who stayed over on days he had early shifts. The note said Lily had a rough night. She might want the rabbit today. Thank you. E. His mother-in-law, Patricia, was the kind of woman who doesn't require explanation. She'd been there from the start of the aftermath, from the weeks when Ethan was trying to hold things together with both hands while the ground moved beneath him. She didn't talk about the past much. Neither did Ethan. They'd built a functional life around the practical requirements of raising Lily well, and they were both in their different ways quietly committed to that project above all others. Ethan walked the floor at 5 a.m. He checked the tertiary suspension joint again. The vibration was measurably worse than it had been the night before. He logged it at priority 1. He pulled up the contact list for the senior engineering team and sent direct messages to Dale Hutchins, to the deputy project director, and after a pause to Victor Hale's office line. He sent them at 5:47 a.m. By 8 a.m., Dale had responded with "Diagnostics clean. Maintenance staff, please direct non-emergency observations through standard channels." Nobody else responded. The demonstration was at 10 a.m. At 9:15, the executives and investors began arriving. Ethan watched from the floor, where he was technically present to assist with any last-minute technical requirements that the maintenance staff were authorized to handle. He watched Victor Hale work the room. Victor was good at this. The handshakes timed precisely, the eye contact held exactly long enough, the smile that said, "We are all in this together, and together we are going to do something that matters." He'd seen Victor do this 100 times. The first 50, he'd found it impressive. The next 50, he'd found it instructive. Now he found it something that didn't quite have a word in English, but that sat in the chest like a stone. Victoria Sterling arrived at 9:40. Ethan had met her once briefly years ago, before Victor had engineered his exit. She was different in person than the way people described her. Sharper, but not in the way that means cruel. In the way that means she's always calculating the distance between where she is and where she needs to be, and the calculation never stops. She didn't recognize him. Of course she didn't. He was a maintenance technician. He was furniture that occasionally moved. The demonstration began at 10:02. Dale Hutchins introduced the machine and its capabilities to the assembled group. He was polished and precise, and he moved through the technical specifications with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed exactly this presentation enough times to have stopped feeling them. Titan Rescue X powered up on schedule. Ethan felt it immediately. He was standing near the south observation wall, which put him about 40 feet from the machine, and the vibration was bad enough now that he could feel it through his boots. Not dramatically. Not the way earthquakes feel. The way a problem feels when it's already decided what it's going to do, and is just working through the mechanics of doing it. He waited through the first 2 minutes of the demonstration. Then he raised his hand. Dale Hutchins did not acknowledge him. Ethan took 3 steps forward. "Excuse me," he said clearly. Several heads turned. "There's something wrong with the machine." The silence that followed had texture. Victoria Sterling looked at him the way he'd already described the sweep from boots to jacket to face the categorization complete within seconds. Victor Hale stepped forward with his practiced warmth. Dale Hutchins recalibrated his smile. And then Victoria asked his name, and Ethan told her, and she picked up the manual, and she threw it. The manual was in his hands now. The cover was open. His name was right there on the inside page in the original formatting in the font that hadn't been changed since the day he submitted this document to the program archive, the day he'd sat at his desk and typed Ethan J. Walker, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has put his name on something he built and believes in. He looked at the words for a long moment. The room was very quiet. He raised his eyes slowly and looked at Victor Hale. Victor's expression had gone through several phases in the last 10 seconds. The warmth was gone. The confidence was going. What was replacing them was something Ethan recognized but had never seen on Victor's face before. The specific expression a man wears when he realizes for the first time that the thing he believed was safely buried has always been right here in this room, and the only reason it hadn't mattered before was that nobody was looking at it. Now everyone was looking at it, and the machine behind them continued to vibrate, quiet and patient and wrong, building towards something that only one person in the room knew how to stop. Ethan looked at Victoria Sterling. "I know what's happening to this machine," he said. His voice was completely level. "And I know how to stop it. But I need you to give me 30 seconds to explain something first." Victoria's face was unreadable. She looked at the manual in his hands. She looked at him. "Talk," she said, and Ethan Walker, who had arrived before sunrise every morning for 3 years and been walked past by everyone in this room and logged warnings that no one read and raised his hand when no one wanted to see it, finally after 5 years began to tell the truth. "Talk," Victoria said. That single word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Everything rippled outward from it. 43 people stopped breathing at approximately the same moment, and the only sounds were the low hum of the facility lights and the machine behind them, that quiet, persistent vibration that Ethan could feel in his molars, building the way pressure builds before something gives. Ethan didn't rush. He'd been waiting 5 years for 30 seconds. He could afford to use them correctly. "The manual in my hands is the original primary engineering design document for Titan Rescue X," he said. He kept his voice at a volume that was clear but not theatrical. This wasn't a performance. This was testimony. It was submitted to the Vanguard Program Archive on March 14th, 6 years ago. The author listed on the cover page is me. Not because someone made an error, because I wrote it. Victoria hadn't moved. Her arms were still crossed. Her expression was still the controlled, calculating stillness of a woman who has navigated too many ambushes to show reaction before she understands what she's reacting to. Victor moved instead. He took 2 steps forward, not aggressive, carefully calibrated, and his voice came out warm and patient. The voice of a man explaining something unfortunate to someone who didn't quite understand the full picture. "Victoria, I want to contextualize this before it derails the demonstration." He gestured toward Ethan with the particular kind of open-handed gesture that says, "I have nothing to hide," while meaning exactly the opposite. Ethan had a limited contributor role on the early-stage project documentation. His name appears on some archival materials because he worked on the initial framework. That doesn't mean he designed the system. "Limited contributor," Ethan said quietly. Victor kept his eyes on Victoria. He didn't look at Ethan. That was deliberate. "The system you're looking at represents 7 years of development by an engineering team of 31 people," Victor continued. "The original framework documents, the ones Ethan worked on, were substantially revised, rebuilt, and expanded well beyond anything in those early drafts. Crediting him as the designer would be like crediting the person who poured the foundation for building the house." It was a good line. Ethan could see it landing with some of the people in the room. The investors, especially people who understood frameworks and revisions, who knew that original ideas rarely survive contact with the engineering process intact, who were already composing a reasonable explanation in their heads, because reasonable explanations are more comfortable than complicated ones. "Can I respond to that?" Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. "You have about 20 seconds before I decide how this goes. Use them. The foundation analogy is accurate," Ethan said. "The problem is that when you remove the load-bearing walls from a foundation and pour concrete over the inspection ports, it's not an improvement. It's a liability." He held up the manual. "This document contains the original emergency monitoring protocol for the tertiary suspension joint. That protocol was removed from the current system. The override sequence embedded in the control firmware, the one that allows a controlled shutdown if resonance reaches critical threshold, was overwritten during a revision approximately 14 months ago." He paused. "I can show you the revision timestamp if you'd like. I saved a copy of the changelog." The room shifted. Dale Hutchins' smile had been degrading for the last 45 seconds, and now it was gone entirely. He looked at Victor with an expression that asked a question Victor didn't answer. "That vibration you can feel right now," Ethan continued, "is the tertiary suspension joint approaching resonance failure. At current load and cycle rate, you have approximately 11 minutes before the lateral arm experiences a cascade event. When that happens, the arm doesn't just stop, it releases. And anything within a 12-foot radius of the machine when that happens is in the impact zone." A government official in a gray suit, a man who had been standing near the back of the room with his hands folded in front of him and the specific posture of someone who makes decisions about public deployment, took one visible step backward. Just one. But everyone saw it. "That's a serious allegation," Victoria said. "I know. If you're wrong, I'm not." Ethan said it without heat, not to be aggressive, because it was simply true, and he'd earned the certainty of saying it simply. "But you don't have to take my word for it. Turn the machine off and let an independent team inspect the tertiary suspension joint. If I'm wrong, I'll walk out of this building and you'll never hear my name again." Silence. The machine hummed. Victor's jaw was tight. "Victoria, this is exactly what I warned you about when I mentioned Ethan's termination history. He was let go for cause after a failed test compromised the program timeline. He's been working in maintenance for 3 years, which means he has had unauthorized access to program-critical equipment during overnight hours. This isn't a safety concern, this is sabotage." That word detonated in the room differently than Victor intended. Not because people believed it immediately, because the moment you use the word sabotage in front of government procurement officials, something procedural engages in their minds. They stop being observers and start being people who are going to have to write reports about what they witnessed today. The gray-suited man in the back cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said in the tone of someone being very careful, "it would be prudent to pause the demonstration pending a brief technical review." Victor turned toward him. "That's not necessary. The system has been through—" "I'd like to hear the technical review," the man said. He said it quietly, but absolutely, and Victor's response died before it fully formed, because some voices in rooms carry weight that has nothing to do with volume, and this man's voice was one of them. Victoria looked at the machine for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "Dale," she said, without looking away from Ethan. "Run a tertiary joint diagnostic. Victoria, the system is certified. Run the diagnostic, Dale." Dale Hutchins walked to the control terminal. The room waited. 40 seconds later, Dale stopped typing. His hands were still on the keyboard. His face was pointed at the screen. Nobody could read his expression from where they were standing because he wasn't showing it to them. "Dale," Victoria said. Dale turned around. "The resonance reading in the tertiary suspension joint," he said slowly, "is at 73% of critical threshold." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. 73%. And the machine had only been running for 4 minutes. Victoria uncrossed her arms. It was the first time she'd changed her physical posture since the beginning of this conversation, and the room registered it, the way rooms register the movement of weather systems, with the understanding that something significant is about to change. "Shut it down," she said. "Victoria," Victor started. "Shut it down." Dale reached for the emergency stop. The machine didn't respond. His hand hit the stop control again. Nothing. He tried the manual override panel. Nothing. His face went a color that Ethan recognized, the specific gray-white of someone realizing that the situation has become substantially worse than they understood 30 seconds ago. "It's not responding to the shutdown commands," Dale said. His voice had gone flat, the way voices go flat when emotion becomes a luxury the situation can't afford. The resonance reading on the diagnostic screen ticked to 76%, then 78. Someone near the back of the room moved toward the exit. Then 2 more people. The gray-suited government official stood completely still, with the focused stillness of a man who has decided that moving before he understands the situation is more dangerous than staying put. Victor Hale turned toward the exit. Ethan was already moving toward the machine. "Ethan!" Victoria's voice followed him. Not a command, not a question. Something between them, the voice of someone who has just run out of better options and is handing the situation to the only person in the room who might actually understand it. He didn't answer. He didn't have time. The left lateral arm was oscillating now. Subtly, not visibly dramatic. Not the thing you'd see in a disaster movie with sparks and alarms. The real kind of mechanical failure, which is quiet and precise and indifferent to the humans standing around it. Ethan put his hands on the access panel at the base of the machine's control column. The panel required a specific sequential press. Not a key, not a code, just a mechanical sequence of 3 contact points in a specific order that he'd built into the original design as a field override for exactly this kind of scenario. A sequence that existed in no manual, no documentation, no revision log, because he'd never written it down. He'd kept it in his head. For 6 years. Because some things you carry where they can't be taken from you. He pressed the first contact point, then the second. The machine made a sound, not an alarm, not a crash. A low settling sound like a held breath being released. The oscillation in the lateral arm slowed. The resonance reading on the diagnostic screen which Dale was watching from across the room, with his hands pressed flat against the terminal like he was trying to hold something down, ticked down. 75, 72, 68. Ethan pressed the third contact point. The machine powered down completely. Not an emergency stop, not a crash shutdown. A clean, controlled, orderly power down, exactly the kind the emergency override was designed to produce. The kind that doesn't stress the structural components, doesn't leave the system in a compromised state, doesn't generate a secondary failure event. The kind only the designer would know how to produce. The facility went quiet, except for the lights. Ethan straightened up slowly. He turned around. Victoria Sterling was standing 12 feet away from him, and she was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face in any of the footage he'd watched, any of the interviews he'd read, any of the versions of Victoria Sterling that existed in the public record. It was not the expression of a CEO. It was the expression of a person who has just watched something that rearranged their understanding of a situation they thought they had completely mapped. "How did you do that?" Dale said. "I built it," Ethan said. The room was silent for 5 full seconds. In a room full of people accustomed to filling silence, that 5 seconds was its own kind of statement. Then the gray-suited government official spoke. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to have a different conversation than the one we came here to have today." Victor Hale, Ethan noticed, was no longer in the room. He'd left at some point in the last 2 minutes. Quietly, efficiently. The way a man leaves a room when he understands that the room has become a place where the truth is about to become the dominant force, and the truth is not a place where Victor Hale has ever been comfortable. Ethan noticed his absence and said nothing. He'd expected it. Victoria noticed it too. Her eyes swept the room, once registered the gap where Victor had been standing, and came back to Ethan. "My office," she said. "Now." It wasn't a question, but it was Ethan understood something different than the way she'd spoken to him an hour ago. It was the voice of someone who needs information and has identified the person who has it. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He followed her out. Behind them, the diagnostic screen still showed the resonance reading falling steadily. Now, the machine cooling into stillness. The crisis that had been building for 14 months, finally interrupted by 3 contact points, and the memory of a man who had never forgotten what he built. Victoria's office on the 14th floor was glass-walled and large, and contained the kind of furniture that signals authority rather than comfort. She didn't sit. She stood behind her desk with her hands on its surface and looked at Ethan across it, and he could see her working the calculation behind her eyes that he imagined ran constantly, the perpetual assessment of information and exposure and risk. "Start from the beginning," she said. So Ethan did. He told her about the project, about the 2 years of engineering, about the design architecture he'd developed, the safety redundancy system, the emergency monitoring protocols, the override sequences he'd built into the firmware before Victor had them removed. He told her about the accelerated testing timeline Victor had pushed for. He told her about the Tuesday evening when Lily's appendix ruptured. He told her about the Thursday afternoon phone call. He told her about the termination meeting and the NDA and the severance package he'd taken because he had a 6-year-old and nothing else. He told her all of it, calmly, precisely. The way an engineer presents findings with sequence and evidence, and without the embellishment that feelings sometimes add when they're allowed to drive the narrative. Victoria listened without interrupting. This surprised him. He'd expected the interruptions, the challenges, the skepticism, the professional distance that executives deploy when they're hearing something that threatens the story they've been operating from. Instead, she was still, and she listened, and her face was doing something he couldn't entirely read. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Victor told me you were terminated for cause," she said finally. "That you'd made design errors that caused the test failure 5 years ago." "I know what Victor told you?" "He had documentation. I know what documentation he had. I also know what he changed in it and when he changed it." Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a printout of the file metadata from the engineering archive showing the original submission dates and the revision timestamps, and the specific user credentials that had made each change. He put it on her desk. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something when you're deciding whether looking at it commits you to something. Then she picked it up. She read it twice. He could tell she read it twice because her eyes went back to the top of the page after reaching the bottom, and the second pass was slower. "These revision timestamps," she said, "show that the critical design documents were altered during the 36-hour period when I was at the hospital with my daughter. Beginning approximately 14 hours after I stopped responding to work communications and ending approximately 6 hours before I received the termination call." Victoria set the paper down. She was quiet again. The calculation behind her eyes was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Not because she was being careless with it, because the calculation itself had grown complex enough that containing it required some visible effort. "If this is accurate," she said. "It is. Then what happened to you was—" She stopped. "Yes," Ethan said simply. She looked at him. "Why did you come back as a maintenance technician? Why not pursue legal action directly? Why not go to a competing firm with what you know?" It was a fair question. It was the obvious question, and he'd been asked a version of it before by Patricia, by the one attorney he'd consulted briefly before deciding that a legal battle would cost more years and more of Lily's childhood than he was willing to spend. "Because the machine wasn't finished yet," Ethan said. "And the thing that was wrong with it wasn't just Victor Hale. The safety architecture that I designed was being built into a system that was going to be deployed in real disasters to rescue real people. If it failed because Victor removed the protocols I put in place, those weren't just engineering errors, they were lives." He paused. "I needed to be close enough to it to stop that from happening." Victoria was very still. "You spent 3 years as a maintenance technician," she said slowly. "Getting up at 4:30 in the morning, servicing equipment, logging warnings that nobody read." "Yes, for that reason." "And because Lily needed stability," he said. "A working parent with a consistent schedule is worth more to a kid than a parent fighting a legal battle for 3 years. I made the choice I could make. This was it." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Not the silence of calculation. Something more human than that. Then Victoria's phone on her desk lit up. She looked at it. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Victor's badge was just used to access the program archive," she said. 3 minutes ago." Ethan stood up immediately. "The backup files," he said. "The original design documents are stored in the physical archive as well as digitally. If he can access the archive, he can destroy the paper trail," Victoria finished. She was already moving. She picked up her desk phone and dialed. "Security. I need 2 people at the program archive on sublevel 2 right now. Nobody leaves that room." She hung up and looked at Ethan. How long? If he's moving fast, he could have the critical documents corrupted or removed in under 4 minutes. She came around the desk. "Then we have 4 minutes," she said. "Move." They went down 14 floors in an elevator that felt slower than it ever had, and Ethan stood with his hands at his sides and felt the controlled, focused clarity that comes when the thing you've been working toward for years finally reaches the moment where it either holds or it doesn't. He wasn't afraid. Fear had evacuated the building years ago, replaced by something simpler and harder, the absolute requirement to see this through. The archive was on sublevel 2. The door was heavy and marked with the kind of signage that communicates restricted access to people who don't have clearance and is ignored by people who do. Victor had clearance. The security team arrived in the hallway at the same moment as Victoria and Ethan, which meant the timing was going to be close enough that it depended on what Victor had already done in the 3 minutes since his badge-registered entry. Victoria put her palm to the access reader. The door opened. Victor was standing at the central filing cabinet with a stack of folders in his hands and a paper shredder running beside him. He turned when the door opened, and for one moment, just one, his face showed exactly what it was. Not the warmth, not the confidence, not the practiced ease of a man who knows which version of himself to deploy in which room. Just the raw, exposed face of a man who has been building a house of cards for 5 years and has just watched someone open the door to the room it's in. He recovered fast. Victor always recovered fast. "Victoria," he said, his voice finding its register again almost immediately. "I can explain what this looks like." "Then explain it quickly," she said. "Because what it looks like is a man destroying evidence. These are outdated archive documents. I've been meaning to clear the dead files for months. This is standard." "That's not true," Ethan said. Victor looked at him. And for the first time since they'd been in the same room today, Victor Hale looked at Ethan Walker directly. Not around him, not through him, at him. It had been 5 years since they'd looked at each other directly. Ethan had imagined this moment before. Not often he was too practical to spend significant time on imagined confrontations, but occasionally in the hour before his alarm at 4:30, he'd let himself think about it, what he'd say, what Victor would look like. He hadn't imagined it would be like this, a sub-level archive room with security guards and a running shredder and a stack of folders in the hands of a man who had spent 5 years believing that the thing he'd done was safe, because the person he'd done it to was too quiet to fight back. The files in that stack include the original test certification reports from 6 years ago, Ethan said. He looked at the folders, not at Victor. At the folders because he knew their contents, and the contents were what mattered. They include the modification logs showing what was changed and when. They include the version history of the safety protocols. He looked up. They're the physical copies of everything I already have digitally. Victor's grip on the folders shifted slightly. "Victor," Ethan said quietly, "you don't need to do this." It was a strange thing to say in this moment, and everyone in the room seemed to understand that. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't mercy. It was the statement of a man who is so certain of his position that he doesn't require the other person to keep running. "The evidence already exists," Ethan said, "in 3 different locations. The copies in your hands aren't the only ones, and destroying them won't change what we both know is in them." Victor looked at him for a long time. Then he set the folders down on top of the filing cabinet. The security guards moved forward. Victoria stepped to the filing cabinet and looked at the folders Victor had set down, and then at the shredder basket, and then at Ethan. "Is there anything already destroyed that we need?" she asked. Ethan looked at the shredder basket. He could see partial sheets, corners, and edges of documents. He read what he could see. "No," he said. The critical documents are in the stack he set down. What's in the shredder is supplementary. The core evidence is intact. Victoria nodded once. Then she looked at Victor, and whatever she said to him in that moment, whatever words passed between them, she said them quietly and didn't include Ethan in them. Which was appropriate, Ethan thought. Some conversations are only for the people who built something together, even when what they built turned out to be built on the wrong things. He turned away and let them have it. He walked to the corner of the archive room and put his back against the wall and stood there. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He was in the vocabulary of his own internal landscape, completely calm, the specific calm of someone who has been climbing a hill for 5 years and has just reached the top and can see clearly in all directions for the first time. He thought about Lily. He thought about the blue thermos with the crooked star and the spelling of his name in the handwriting of a 5-year-old who didn't know yet that the world had decided to forget his father, but loved him completely without needing a reason. He thought about the morning she'd asked him 3 years ago when he was packing his lunch at 4:40 a.m. and she'd appeared in the kitchen doorway with her rabbit and her sleep-tangled hair. Why he went to the same place every day when the people there weren't nice to him. He'd crouched down to her level. He'd thought about what to say. Because something there needs to be fixed, he'd told her finally. And I'm the only one who knows how to fix it. She'd considered this with the devastating seriousness of a child evaluating logic. Is it broken because someone made a mistake? She'd asked. Yes, he'd said. Is the someone sorry? Not yet. But they will be. He'd looked at her for a moment. At the certainty in her face, the clean, uncomplicated certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt that the right thing eventually happens. Yeah, he'd said. I think they will be. She'd gone back to bed apparently satisfied with this. He stood against the archive wall and thought about that conversation and let himself have the feeling that went with it. Not triumph, that wasn't the right word for it. Something quieter and more solid. The feeling of a thing that was wrong being made right, which is different from victory because it doesn't have an opponent. It's just the world returning to the shape it should have been in all along. Behind him, he could hear Victoria's voice, low and controlled, and Victor's voice, which was no longer controlled at all. The security guards were still and watchful. The shredder had stopped running. And somewhere in the stack of folders on top of the filing cabinet, in a document submitted to the program archive on March 14th. 6 years ago, Ethan Walker's name remained exactly where he had put it. Where it had always been. Waiting for the room to finally be quiet enough to read it. Victor Hale didn't go quietly. That was the first thing Ethan learned about the difference between how he'd imagined this moment and how it actually played out. In the version he'd carried in his head, the one he'd constructed during the 4:17 a.m. hours, when the house was dark and Lily was breathing steadily down the hall, and there was nothing to do but think Victor's unraveling had been clean. Sudden. The moment the evidence appeared, the structure collapsed. Simple cause and effect, the way engineering problems resolve when you apply the correct solution. Real life. Ethan was relearning doesn't work in clean collapses. Victor sat across from Victoria in the 14th floor conference room, the same building 2 floors above her office, a room with glass walls and a long table and chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And he talked for 47 minutes. Ethan knew it was 47 minutes because he was sitting at the far end of the table with the stack of archive folders in front of him and his hands folded on top of them, and he watched the clock on the wall behind Victor's head the entire time, because watching Victor's face for 47 minutes would have required more of a certain kind of patience than Ethan currently had access to. Victor didn't confess. That was important to understand. He didn't sit down and say, I did it, and I'm sorry, and here's what I did. What Victor did was considerably more sophisticated than confession and considerably more exhausting to sit through. He reframed. He contextualized. He built alternative architecture around the facts the way you build scaffolding around a damaged structure, not to repair it, but to change what people see when they look at it. He said things like the accelerated timeline was a collective decision, not a unilateral one. He said that the modifications to Ethan's safety protocols had been reviewed and approved by the engineering team, which was technically true if you defined approved as processed through a documentation system where nobody checked whether the changes were safe, because Victor had told them the lead engineer had already signed off. He said that Ethan's termination had been handled through proper HR processes, also technically true in the same way that a rigged game is technically a game. He was good at this. Ethan had always known Victor was good at this. The skill that had made him valuable as a program partner, the ability to shape narrative to read rooms and give them what they needed, was exactly the skill that made him dangerous when he turned it toward self-preservation. But this time, there was a difference. This time, Ethan had the folders. Every time Victor built a layer of alternative explanation, Ethan slid a document to the center of the table without comment. Just the document. Let it exist. The revision timestamp. The original version. The authorization signature that appeared in the modification log under Victor's credentials. The third time Ethan did this, Victoria held up her hand to stop Victor mid-sentence. She picked up the document. Read it. Set it down. Victor, she said. The modification to the emergency shutdown protocol on March 3rd. Your credentials are on the authorization. That was a routine system update. It removed the shutdown protocol from the active firmware. The protocol was redundant with the... It was the only shutdown protocol, Ethan said. Silence. It was the only shutdown protocol in the tertiary suspension joint management system, he continued. There was no redundancy to be redundant with. I know because I designed both the protocol and the system it managed. They were not redundant. They were dependent. Removing one made the other inoperable. Victor looked at him. For the first time in 47 minutes, Victor looked at Ethan with something that wasn't performance. Just two men who had once worked towards something together, sitting across a table from each other, with 5 years of wreckage between them, and one of them finally running out of scaffolding. You knew about the shutdown issue, Victor said. It wasn't a question. It came out quiet. Before today, you knew. I identified the resonance buildup 6 weeks ago, Ethan said. I filed a Priority 2 maintenance report. Dale Hutchins sent me back a note about proper submission channels. Something moved across Victor's face. Something complicated. Not guilt exactly guilt as clean guilt is about knowing you did wrong. This was something murkier. The expression of a man realizing that the thing he'd spent 5 years controlling had been being watched by someone he'd believed wasn't capable of watching. How long have you been here? Victor said. 3 years. As a maintenance technician? Yes. Victor absorbed this. Why? Because someone needed to make sure this machine didn't hurt people, Ethan said. And because you took everything else, but you couldn't take what I knew. The room was very quiet. Victoria had stopped writing on the notepad in front of her. She was looking at Ethan with the expression she'd worn in the archive room, that rearranged look, the one that said her understanding of the situation had been reconfigured into something she was still integrating. Then her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Her expression changed into something sharper and colder. Legal is downstairs, she said. She looked at Victor. And the board is asking for an emergency briefing. She stood up. Don't go anywhere. She left. The two of them were alone. Ethan hadn't planned for this. He'd mapped a lot of scenarios over 3 years, but he hadn't specifically planned for sitting alone in a conference room with Victor Hale in the 40-second window between Victoria leaving and whoever came next arriving. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I thought you'd left. I know. I thought after the NDA. He stopped. Tried again. I thought you'd moved on. I have a daughter, Ethan said. I moved on to her. I didn't move on from this. Victor looked at the table, not at the documents past them, the look of a man staring at something that isn't in the room. I want you to understand something, Victor said slowly. Not as an excuse. I know it's not an excuse, but I want you to understand it. Ethan waited. I worked on this project for 2 years, Victor said. I built the relationships. I got the funding. I sat in rooms with people who had the power to make this thing real, and I convinced them it was worth their money and their time. And then at every presentation, at every investor meeting, every single time someone asked who built this, the answer was a name that wasn't mine. He paused. "I know that's how it should work. I know the person who designs the thing is the person who should get credit for the thing. I know that. But knowing something and living with it are different." Ethan looked at him. "That's what you tell yourself," Ethan said. It wasn't angry. It was simply observational, the way you identify a component. That's the story you built around it. Yes. But the story you built around it included my daughter not having a father with a career. It included 14 months of safety protocols being absent from a machine that's about to be deployed in actual disasters. It included real people being in real danger. Ethan paused. "Your discomfort about credit doesn't weigh the same as those things, Victor." Victor said nothing. He had nothing left to say to that. There is no architecture you can build around that particular truth. It stands by itself. The door opened. 2 members of Vanguard's legal team entered. One of them placed a hand briefly on Victor's shoulder, not supportive procedural, and the other one began setting documents on the table that had nothing to do with engineering. Ethan picked up the archive folders and stood. He was at the door when Victor spoke again. "For what it's worth," Victor said. Ethan stopped, didn't turn around. "I knew you'd built something real," Victor said. "That was never the question. I never doubted that you were the best engineer I'd ever worked with." Ethan stood in the doorway. "That makes it worse," he said, and left. He meant it. He'd thought about this too in the 4:17 a.m. hours. Whether it would be better or worse to discover that Victor had stolen from him because he'd believed Ethan's work wasn't valuable enough to matter. And he'd always arrived at the same answer. It's worse to be robbed by someone who knew exactly what they were taking. He walked down the hallway toward the elevator with the folders under his arm, and for a moment, just one moment, before he got the feeling under control, he felt the full weight of the 5 years. Not as anger, as something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. He pressed the elevator button. He thought about Lily asking him if he was the only one who could fix it. "Yeah," he'd told her. "I think they will be." The elevator opened. He got in. He rode down alone and let himself feel all of it, just for the length of an elevator ride, because he was a practical man, and he understood that you have to let the feelings happen somewhere, or they happen somewhere worse. And then the doors opened on the lobby level and he walked out into the fluorescent light and squared his shoulders and got back to work. Because there was still work to do. The independent engineering review team arrived at the Vanguard facility at 2:17 p.m. that same afternoon. Victoria had moved fast. This was something Ethan was coming to understand about her. She processed information differently than most executives he'd encountered. Not slower, not faster, but more completely. When her understanding of a situation changed, her response to it changed at the same rate, without the lag time that most people require to emotionally adjust to the distance between what they believed and what turned out to be true. She'd made 4 calls from the hallway outside the conference room before the legal team had even sat down. And by early afternoon, she had 3 things happening simultaneously. An independent structural and mechanical audit of Titan Rescue X, a full forensic review of the program's engineering documentation and revision history by an outside firm, and a conversation with the government procurement official, the gray-suited man whose name turned out to be Richard Farrow, Deputy Director of the Federal Emergency Response Technology Division, that was by all accounts going to be a difficult one. Ethan was in the facility when the audit team arrived. He'd been asked, not ordered asked, which was already different to remain available. He'd called Patricia to let her know he'd be late. Patricia had said what Patricia always said in these situations, which was nothing except okay. And the particular tone of okay, that meant she understood it was serious and she had it handled. He walked the audit team through the machine with the deliberate attention of a man returning to something he built a long time ago and finding it both familiar and changed. He showed them the tertiary suspension joint. He showed them the control firmware architecture. He showed them where the emergency monitoring protocol had been and where it wasn't anymore, and what the original design intent had been. The lead auditor, a woman named Dr. Carla Simmons, who had the kind of focused professional skepticism that Ethan respected enormously, asked him twice to repeat technical specifications, and made him show her the original documentation before she accepted any claim. He appreciated this. He appreciated it more than if she'd simply believed him, because belief without verification is not the way things should work in engineering, and the fact that she was doing it right meant her eventual conclusions would mean something. At 4:42 p.m., Dr. Simmons found the second issue. Ethan hadn't known about the second issue. He'd been focused on the tertiary suspension joint, the problem he'd identified. The problem he could document, the problem he'd been watching build for 6 weeks. But the audit team, working methodically through the system architecture, found something Ethan hadn't caught, because it was in a subsystem he didn't have direct maintenance access to during overnight hours. The navigation collision avoidance algorithm had been modified. It was a subtle modification, the kind that wouldn't show up in casual review, the kind that required side-by-side comparison of the original design specifications and the current firmware version. But the modification had changed the emergency evacuation path calculation in a way that, under certain debris field configurations, would direct Titan Rescue X to navigate toward an exit route rather than away from a structural collapse vector, which meant that in a specific scenario, a building collapse with a particular debris distribution pattern, the machine designed to rescue trapped civilians could instead move toward them in a way that increased the structural load on an already compromised section. Dr. Simmons showed Ethan the comparison on her laptop screen without saying anything first. She just turned the screen toward him and let him read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her. "When was this modified?" he said. She showed him the timestamp. 22 months ago. Victor's credentials were not on this one. The credentials on this modification belonged to Dale Hutchins. Ethan sat with this information for a moment. He sorted through its implications with the systematic attention that 5 years of 4:17 a.m. thinking had honed into something close to a reflex. Dale Hutchins. 52 years old, degrees from MIT and Stanford, the man who'd smiled at Ethan on the demonstration floor that morning and told him the diagnostics were clean. "Did Victor know about this modification?" Ethan asked. Dr. Simmons shook her head. "I can't answer that. That's not my area. But the modification happened 22 months ago." "Yes. And the main safety protocol modifications happened 14 months ago." "That's what the documentation shows." Ethan worked the timeline in his head. Victor had been removing safety systems. Dale had been modifying navigation algorithms. 2 people. 2 separate tracks of modification. Both happening under the umbrella of a project that was racing toward a demonstration that was worth billions of dollars. The question that formed in Ethan's mind was not whether these 2 men had coordinated. The question was something quieter and more disturbing. Had they even needed to, or had they each independently made the calculation that cutting corners served the timeline, and the timeline served the demonstration, and the demonstration served the contract, and nothing in the system that surrounded them had been strong enough to stop either of them from making that calculation? He thought about that for a long time. Dr. Simmons gave her preliminary findings to Victoria at 5:30 p.m. in Victoria's office. Ethan was present at Victoria's request. He stood by the window, not sitting. He was too focused to sit, while Dr. Simmons walked through the 2 critical issues, the tertiary suspension joint and the navigation algorithm, with the methodical precision of someone who documents disasters for a living and has learned to deliver bad news without ornamentation. Victoria listened, with her hands flat on the desk, her posture completely still, her face doing the unreadable thing that Ethan was beginning to understand was not blankness, but density, the compression of a lot of processing into a very contained space. When Dr. Simmons finished, Victoria was quiet for 4 seconds. Ethan counted them. "If this machine had been deployed," Victoria said, "in an active disaster scenario, based on what you found, what's the realistic failure probability?" Dr. Simmons didn't soften it. Under standard rescue deployment conditions, the navigation issue alone carries a high probability of adverse outcome in approximately 30% of structural collapse scenarios. Combined with the suspension joint failure risk under extended load, I would characterize the system as not field deployable in its current state. Victoria closed her eyes. Just for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then they opened again, and she was back. "Ethan," she said. "Yes. How long to rebuild the safety architecture to your original design specifications?" He'd already been thinking about it. He'd been thinking about it since the audit team had arrived, the way an engineer thinks about solutions, while the problem is still being fully defined, not because you jump ahead, but because some part of your mind is always already working on what happens next. "The emergency shutdown protocol can be restored in about 72 hours, he said. "The navigation algorithm is more complex. That's 60 to 90 days with the right team working directly from my original design documents. And the suspension joint. That's a mechanical repair. 7 days, maybe 10. The component itself isn't damaged, just stressed. With proper recalibration and the monitoring protocol back in place, it's structurally sound." Victoria nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Direct access to the engineering team. No intermediaries. The original design files from my backup archive. And someone with authority to make decisions without a committee." Victoria almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the movement that precedes one that stops just before completing. "I can manage that last part," she said. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and the almost smile was gone. "Richard Farrow wants a meeting," she said. "Tonight." Ethan understood what that meant. The government official. The man who'd stepped back during the demonstration. The man who'd asked for a technical review. The man who had the authority to pull the federal contract and take it somewhere else. The man whose call tonight would determine whether Vanguard Robotics survived what had happened in its own demonstration room that morning. "Do you want me there?" Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. "Yes," she said. "But not as a maintenance technician." He held her gaze. "What then?" "As what you are," she said simply. The meeting with Richard Farrow happened at 7 p.m. in a smaller conference room, with coffee that nobody drank, and a tension in the room that was the specific tension of a very large amount of money and a very large amount of public trust sitting in the same space together and not being sure they were compatible. Farrow was a deliberate man, not slow deliberate. Every question he asked had been considered before he asked it, and he waited for complete answers before moving to the next one. He didn't perform skepticism. He simply applied it evenly and without personal weight the way a good auditor applies process. He asked Victoria about the safety failures. She answered completely. He asked about Victor Hale's role. She answered that too, and to her credit, and Ethan noted, this filed it, she answered it without minimizing it or building walls around it. She told Farrow what had been done, and by whom, and what the documentation showed, and she did it with the directness of someone who has decided that the truth is the only available currency in this particular transaction. Then Farrow looked at Ethan. "You were the lead engineer on the original design," he said. "Yes. And you've been working here for 3 years as a maintenance technician." "Yes." "Why didn't you go to a regulatory body? The safety violations you identified were in a system that hadn't been deployed yet," Ethan said. "The NDA I signed covered the original termination circumstances, but it didn't cover ongoing safety violations. I understand that now, in retrospect. At the time, I wasn't certain what I could say, and what I couldn't, and I had a daughter to think about." He paused. "I made the decision I could make. I placed myself where I could do the most direct good. I'm not certain it was the right decision. I know it was the decision I made." Farrow studied him. "You saved the machine today." "I stopped the failure today," Ethan said. "Saving it is the next part. And you believe you can do that." "I built it the first time," Ethan said. "Yes, I believe I can." Farrow was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Victoria, "What's the timeline for full safety certification if the system is rebuilt to the original design specifications?" 90 days, Victoria said, with Ethan leading the engineering team directly. "And in the interim, "The machine is grounded," Victoria said. "Completely. No testing, no demonstrations, no deployment conversations." "That's a significant revenue impact." "I know. The board is going to hear from me tonight," Victoria said. "And they're going to hear what the board needs to hear, which is that the alternative to 90 days and a revenue delay is a deployed machine that fails during an actual rescue operation and kills people. Because that's what the alternative is." The room was quiet. Pharaoh looked at Victoria for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Just that. All right." 2 syllables that kept the federal contract alive. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose so that nobody in the room would see it. On the drive home that night at 9:43, Ethan sat in his car in the parking lot for 4 minutes before starting the engine. Not because he was gathering himself, because he was letting himself feel for the second time that day, the second and last time, because he was going to go home and make dinner and sit with his daughter and be fully present the size of what had happened. Victor was going to face consequences. He didn't know yet what shape those consequences would take, but the legal team was involved, and the documentation was in place, and the structure that had protected Victor for 5 years had been disassembled today from the inside by the one person Victor had believed would never get close enough to do it. The machine was going to be made right. Not quickly, not cheaply, not without the cost of 90 days and the board's fury, and a revenue impact that Victoria was going to have to absorb with both hands. But it was going to be made right. The safety architecture that Ethan had designed was going to be restored, which meant that when Titan Rescue X eventually deployed in real disaster conditions, the people it was supposed to rescue had a real chance of being rescued. Dale Hutchins had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Dr. Simmons's team was staying on through the week, and Ethan was going home. He started the car. When he walked through the door at 9:51, Lily was supposed to be asleep. She was not asleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her rabbit and a cup of the warm milk Patricia made when Lily couldn't settle, and she looked up when the door opened with the specific alertness of a child who has been waiting. "You're late," she said. "I know." He sat down across from her. "Couldn't be helped." "Grandma said something happened at work." "Something did." She studied him with the unnerving perceptiveness that she'd had since she was about 3, and that Ethan had never fully gotten used to. Good something or bad something. He thought about Victor's face in the archive room. He thought about Dr. Simmons turning her laptop screen toward him. He thought about Pharaoh saying all right. He thought about Victoria saying, "as what you are." "Both," he said honestly. "But it's going to be okay." Lily considered this. "Did you fix the thing that was broken?" she asked. He looked at her. At the rabbit in the crook of her arm, and the warm milk, and the kitchen table, where they'd had 10,000 meals together, the dinners he'd made at the end of long shifts, and the breakfasts before early mornings, and every ordinary shared moment that had been the actual substance of the last 5 years while everything else was happening. "Started to," he said. "There's still more to do." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this. "Okay," she said. "Grandma left your dinner in the oven." She climbed down from the table and headed toward the hallway, then stopped and looked back at him with her hand on the wall. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad it's the good kind of both." She disappeared down the hall. He sat alone in the kitchen for a moment, with his hands on the table, and let himself have the full feeling of that his daughter in her pajamas in the house they'd held on to through 5 difficult years, telling him she was glad. Then he got up and took his dinner out of the oven and ate it, and washed his plate, and set his alarm for 4:30 and went to bed. Tomorrow, there was work to do. There was always still work to do, and for the first time in 5 years that felt like something other than a burden. The alarm went off at 4:30 the next morning, same as always. Ethan reached over and silenced it in the dark. He lay still for exactly 30 seconds, not because he needed the time to wake up, but because he'd developed the habit years ago of using those 30 seconds to locate himself. To take inventory of where things stood before the day started moving. It was an engineering instinct applied to living before you work on a system. Understand its current state. Current state. Victor Hale had been removed from the building the previous evening by security, with legal counsel present pending formal proceedings. Dale Hutchins remained on administrative leave. Dr. Simmons's audit team was scheduled to resume at 8. Victoria had called an emergency board meeting for 7 a.m., which meant she was either already awake or hadn't slept at all. The federal contract was still alive conditionally. And Ethan Walker, who had been an overnight maintenance technician for 3 years, was scheduled to meet with the head of the engineering division at 9 to begin the rebuild process. He got up, made coffee, poured it into the blue thermos. The house was quiet. Lily was sleeping. Patricia had stayed over again without being asked, which was her way of communicating that she understood something significant was happening without requiring the details. He left a note on the counter. All good. Big day. Thank you. E. He drove to Vanguard in the dark. The difference between this morning and every other morning for 3 years was not something Ethan could have named precisely, but he felt it in the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatically, not as a sudden shift, but as a settled awareness that the atmosphere around you has reorganized itself into something different. The parking lot was the same. The security checkpoint was the same. The fluorescent lights in the lobby hummed at the same frequency they always had. But the security guard at the front desk, a man named Carl, who had nodded at Ethan every morning for 3 years with the automatic acknowledgement of someone processing a familiar fixture, looked up when Ethan came through the door and actually made eye contact. "Morning," Carl said, like he meant it. "Morning," Ethan said. He clocked in and walked the floor. Not because he was required to. His maintenance shift technically didn't start for another 40 minutes, but because the floor was where he thought clearly and there was a great deal to think about. The board meeting that Victoria was walking into at 7 a.m. was not going to be gentle. Ethan didn't have direct intelligence on the board's composition or their specific positions, but he understood the dynamics from the outside: a product failure, a leadership scandal, a grounded demonstration, and a 90-day delay on a billion-dollar contract. That was the kind of morning that made board members reconsider everything, including the CEO, who had been standing at the front of the room when it happened. He wondered if Victoria understood the risk she was taking. Then he thought about how she'd handled Richard Farrow the previous evening, and he decided she understood it completely. At 6:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. He pulled it out. A text from an unknown number. "This is Victoria. Meeting moved to 6:30. It's already started. Where are you?" He looked at the text for a second. Then he typed, "Floor 3. Be there in 4 minutes." He took the elevator up. The board meeting was happening in the main executive conference room on the 16th floor. A room Ethan had never been in before, had passed on the floor plan when servicing HVAC components in the adjacent utility corridor, had understood the theoretical existence of, but never occupied. He knocked twice and opened the door when Victoria's voice said, "Come in." There were 9 people around the table. 8 of them were in suits. One of them was Ethan in the same work jacket, with the faded embroidered name on the breast pocket that he'd worn the day before when the manual hit his chest. He was aware of this. He'd thought about it for the 3 seconds between the elevator opening and the conference room door, and he'd decided it didn't matter. The jacket was clean. He'd earned what was inside it. Victoria was standing at the head of the table. She looked like she'd had about 3 hours of sleep and had converted all of them into a form of focused energy that most people couldn't generate even fully rested. She gestured toward an empty chair to her right without preamble. "Ethan Walker," she said to the room. "Most of you have now read the preliminary incident report from yesterday. Ethan is the original design engineer for Titan Rescue X. He's going to answer questions about the rebuild plan." A board member at the far end of the table, a heavy-set man named Gerald Marsh, whose name Ethan had seen on documents before one of the company's founding investors, leaned forward. "Let me make sure I understand the situation," Gerald said. His voice was the voice of a man who has spent 40 years using his voice to make rooms smaller. "We have a billion-dollar product demonstration that failed yesterday in front of federal procurement officials. We have evidence that our chief innovation officer spent 5 years falsifying engineering documentation and misrepresenting intellectual property. We have a navigation algorithm that a third-party audit says makes our rescue robot potentially hazardous in exactly the situations it's supposed to help in. And the person who caught all of this," he looked at Ethan, "was working the overnight shift." "Yes," Victoria said. "And our response to this situation is to put the overnight shift worker in charge of fixing it." "He designed the system," Victoria said. "He identified the failures. He executed the emergency shutdown yesterday with a sequence that exists in no documentation anywhere because he kept it in his head. He is the most qualified person in this building to lead the rebuild." Gerald looked at Ethan. "How do I know you can actually do what she's describing?" Ethan met his gaze. "You don't. Not yet. That's what the 90 days is for." Gerald blinked. He'd been expecting either deference or oversell and got neither. Another board member, a woman named Sandra Okafor, whose expression throughout this exchange had been unreadable in a way that suggested she was listening more carefully than anyone else in the room, spoke for the first time. "What's the failure scenario if we don't do the rebuild and try to push the current system through certification?" "Titan Rescue X gets deployed," Ethan said. "It operates normally under standard conditions for some period of time. Then it encounters a specific debris field configuration in an actual structural collapse, a real building with real people inside, and the navigation algorithm sends it the wrong direction. At which point you have a 9-foot rescue robot adding weight to an already compromised structure, and the people it was supposed to help are now in a worse situation than before it arrived." The room was very quiet. "The probability of that scenario," Sandra said, "Dr. Simmons' team assessed it at 30% under field deployment conditions," Ethan said. "That's not the probability of a rare failure. That's nearly 1 in 3. Gerald had stopped leaning forward. He was sitting back now, with the particular posture of a man whose objections have encountered something they can't move. The board authorized the rebuild at 7:34 a.m. It wasn't unanimous. Gerald voted against it, not because he believed the rebuild was wrong, but because he wanted something on record that said he'd ask the harder questions. Ethan understood this. It was the same impulse that makes engineers include skeptical annotations in their own design documents, not because they doubt the design, but because the doubt is part of what makes the record complete. He walked out of that board meeting with authorization to lead a 31-person engineering team in rebuilding the safety architecture of the most important project in Vanguard's history, with a 90-day timeline and a federal contract that could evaporate if the timeline slipped. He stood in the hallway outside the conference room and took a breath. Then he went to find the engineering team. The engineering team received him the way people receive a significant change in weather, some with adjustment, some with resistance, some with the particular wariness of people who have been working in a specific way for a long time and are being asked to work differently. He understood this. He'd spent enough time around engineers to know that skepticism directed at new leadership is not personal and is in fact professionally appropriate. You don't trust a system because someone tells you to trust it. You trust it after it demonstrates that it works. He didn't make a speech. He didn't give a vision statement. He set up a whiteboard in the main engineering bay at 9 a.m., drew the original architecture of the safety system from memory, every component, every connection, every dependency, and started asking questions. Not rhetorical questions. Actual questions. What changed in month 14 and why? Who made the call to modify the tertiary joint management? What was the engineering rationale documented for the navigation algorithm? Revision. Some of the answers were defensive. Some of them were confused. A few of the engineers in the room had genuinely not known the extent of what had been modified, and their responses had the quality of people being shown something about their own work that they hadn't seen before, which is its own specific kind of uncomfortable. One engineer, a young woman named Priya, 3 years out of Georgia Tech, who had been on the team for 18 months, put her hand up about 20 minutes in. "The navigation modification," she said carefully. "I flagged it when it was implemented. I sent a note to Dale saying the change didn't align with the original design parameters." Ethan looked at her. "What did Dale say?" "He said the original parameters were outdated and the revision had been approved at the senior level." "Did you follow up?" She looked at her hands. "Once. He said it again. I let it go." She paused. "I shouldn't have." Ethan held her gaze for a moment. "No, you shouldn't have." He said it without judgment and without softening. Because it was true, and she knew it was true. And the most respectful thing you can do for someone who knows they made an error is to confirm it clearly and then keep moving. What matters now is that you caught it initially, you documented it, and that documentation is part of what Dr. Simmons' team found yesterday. It's part of the evidence that's going to make this system right. He paused. "I need that instinct on this team for the next 90 days. Can you stay on this?" Priya looked at him, something settled in her face. "Yes." "Good." He turned back to the whiteboard. By noon, the engineering team had divided into 3 working groups: suspension system, rehabilitation firmware, safety protocol, restoration and navigation algorithm, rebuild. Ethan rotated between them throughout the afternoon, not managing from above, but working alongside, sitting at terminals reviewing code, asking the questions that moved people from what they thought toward what could be shown. At 2:15 p.m., he got a message from Victoria's assistant asking him to come to her office when he had a moment. He went up at 2:30. Victoria was behind her desk. She looked slightly more rested than she had at 7 in the morning, which was a modest improvement. She had 2 cups of coffee on her desk and pushed one toward him when he sat down, which was not a gesture he'd expected from her, and which he received without comment, because some gestures don't require comment. "The board wants daily updates," she said. "I can do that." "Gerald Marsh wants to assign an oversight engineer from outside the company to monitor the rebuild progress." Ethan considered this. "Who?" "His choice. He's proposing a firm called Leland Technical." "Leland Technical certified the original modified system," Ethan said. Victoria was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You're sure? The certification documents are in the archive folders I brought up yesterday." Leland Technical was the certifying firm for the modification package 14 months ago. Victoria picked up her phone and sent a message. Ethan watched her do it. She typed quickly, and without hesitation, the decisiveness of someone who processes conflict as information rather than threat. "Gerald is going to push back," she said, setting the phone down. "I know. He's going to say you have a conflict of interest. I designed the system, and Victor stole it from me, and I spent 3 years as a maintenance technician to get close enough to fix it," Ethan said. "I don't think conflict of interest is the most pressing issue in this situation." Victoria looked at him for a moment. And then for the first time since he'd met her in the brief chaos of a demonstration room 28 hours ago, she laughed. Not performed laughter, not the professional kind. A short, genuine sound of someone encountering a truth so direct it bypasses the usual filters. "Fair point," she said. The laughter faded, and something else came into her expression. Something he hadn't seen on her face before. Not calculation, not authority, not the controlled uncertainty of a leader navigating a crisis. Something more direct than any of those. "I owe you an apology," she said. Ethan didn't say anything, not just for what happened yesterday, for the culture that allowed what happened to you to happen at all. She was precise with her words, the way she was precise with everything. "I have spent 15 years building this company on the principle that results are what matter, and the people who produce the results are the assets worth protecting. I believed that's what I was doing." She paused. "Yesterday made me understand that I was protecting results and calling it protecting people. Those aren't the same thing." Ethan held his coffee cup and looked at her. He'd spent a fair amount of time over the years thinking about what he would feel in this moment if this moment ever came. He'd expected something cleaner than what he actually felt, which was not triumph or vindication, but something more complicated. Something that recognized the genuineness of what she was saying while also holding steady the knowledge of what it had cost to get to this room. "I believe you mean that," he said finally. "But," she said, because she could hear the unfinished sentence. "But the apology doesn't reach back," he said. "It doesn't change what Lily grew up watching. It doesn't give me back the years I spent logging warnings nobody read." He set his cup down. "I'm not saying that to be harsh. I'm saying it because if the apology is going to mean something more than this conversation, it has to change something going forward that those years didn't have." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Tell me what that looks like." "3 things," he said. "Tell me." Every engineer's contribution gets documented and attributed. Not just the senior leads, not just the people in the presentations. Everyone who contributes to a design gets their name in the record, permanently and accurately. "Done," she said. "Safety reports filed at any level get reviewed at the senior level within 48 hours. Not routed through intermediate approvals. Not filtered through project leads. Direct review. Every time." That's a structural change to the reporting system. "I know." She didn't hesitate. "Done. And no employee gets made to feel like what I felt in that demonstration room," Ethan said. His voice stayed level, not angry, but specific. "Not because they're wearing a work jacket instead of a suit. Not because they're on a maintenance crew instead of an engineering team. The value of what a person knows doesn't change based on where they're standing in the room." The office was quiet. Victoria looked at him for a long time. "That last one is harder than a policy change," she said. "I know. You can't write a memo that changes how people see each other." "No," he agreed. "But you can change what happens when the person in the work jacket is right and the person in the suit is wrong. You can change whose voice gets taken seriously in what room. You can change the feedback that the organization gives to people about whether their knowledge matters." He paused. "The culture follows the decisions. Make the decisions differently, and eventually the culture follows." She was quiet for another moment. "All 3, she said. "I'll make it happen." "Then I accept the apology," he said. Victoria nodded, and for a moment they sat with that 2 people on opposite ends of something that had cost a great deal to traverse, finding the ground on the other side. Then her phone buzzed again, and the moment ended the way most significant moments in professional life end, not with music or cinematography, but with the next thing that needs handling. She looked at her phone. "Gerald has accepted Dr. Simmons' firm as the independent oversight instead of Leland." "Good. He's also asking that you present the rebuild timeline to the full board on Friday." "I'll be ready." She looked up. "You'll need to present it differently than you presented things to me." "Different how?" "Gerald Marsh has been in rooms where engineers present technical plans for 40 years, she said. "He speaks that language. But the other 6 board members are investors and business strategists. They need to understand what they're authorizing in terms of risk and outcome, not component architecture." Ethan considered this. "You're telling me to tell the story, not just the specifications." "I'm telling you to tell the story and the specifications, in that order." He stood up. "I can do that." He was at the door when she said his name. He turned. "For what it's worth," she said, and something about the phrase snagged in his memory, because Victor had said the same 4 words the day before in the conference room, before saying something that had landed the wrong way. "I've been in rooms with a lot of engineers over 15 years. I've heard a lot of people talk about systems they built." He waited. "I've never heard anyone talk about a machine the way you do," she said. "Like it's something you're responsible for. Not in a liability sense, in the way you talk about someone you care about." Ethan thought about standing on the demonstration floor at 5 in the morning with his hand flat against the lateral arm housing, feeling the vibration that nobody else was feeling. He thought about 6 years of a design living in his head the way things live in your head when you built them from the ground up, when you understood every component and every connection and every place where it could fail and every way you tried to make sure it wouldn't. "I spent 2 years building it," he said. Then 5 years making sure it survived what was done to it. He paused. I guess that becomes something. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. It does. He left. The next 72 hours were the most focused work of Ethan's professional life. Not the hardest. The hardest had been the first weeks after the termination, holding everything together with both hands while the ground moved. Not the most painful, but the most focused. The way work gets focused when the purpose behind it has been made completely clear, and the obstacles have been removed, and what's left is just the thing itself, the problem and the solution, and the people working toward it. He was on the floor by 5 every morning. He worked with each team in rotation, spending time where it was needed, pulling back when people were moving well on their own, and inserting himself when something wasn't resolving. He ate at his desk and answered questions by text at midnight, and was back on the floor by 5 and did it again. On the second evening, Priya stopped him in the hallway outside the engineering bay at 7 p.m. with a look on her face that he'd learned to recognize in the last 2 days as her version of controlled urgency. The firmware restoration, she said. I found something in the original code. He stopped. Show me. She led him back to her terminal and pulled up a comparison view. The original firmware from his backup archive on the left, the current system on the right. She pointed to a section in the emergency management subroutine. This block, she said. In the original, it runs a 3-stage verification before the shutdown command executes. Checks the resonance reading, confirms the command source is authorized, then initiates the controlled power down sequence in stages. She highlighted a section in the current version. In the modified firmware, the 3-stage verification is replaced with a single command check. Faster, simpler. And the problem with that, Ethan said, if you get a false command signal, electromagnetic interference, a sensor, misread a communication error during field operation, the original 3-stage would catch it. The modified single check won't. You could get an unintended shutdown in the middle of an active rescue. Ethan stared at the screen. So the modification that was supposed to speed up the system, he said slowly, also made it possible for the machine to shut down on its own during a rescue operation. Yes. Victor removed the safety protocol that prevented resonance failure, he said, and whoever modified the firmware made it possible for the machine to fail in a completely different way that nobody was looking at, Priya finished. They looked at each other. How long has this been in the firmware? Ethan said. Priya checked the timestamp. 27 months. And Dale's navigation modification was 22 months ago. Yes. So the firmware was changed first, Ethan said, and then the navigation was changed, and then Victor's protocol removal was 14 months ago. He sat back. 3 separate modifications, 3 separate people or authorization chains, all making the system less safe, all at different times, none of them apparently aware of what the others were doing. Priya was quiet. It wasn't a conspiracy, she said slowly. It was just everyone cutting corners on their piece, Ethan said, not knowing or not caring how the pieces connected, because nobody was looking at the whole system. He paused. Because the person who understood the whole system was working the overnight maintenance shift. The weight of that sat in the room. He thought about what he'd told Victoria in her office. The culture follows the decisions. But the culture had also produced a project where 3 different people had each made the calculation that their modification was small enough to not matter in an organization that had decided the timeline mattered more than the questions, which meant nobody was asking the questions that would have caught any of it. Not one failure, 3 parallel failures, operating simultaneously, in a machine designed to save lives. Add it to the firmware restoration scope, Ethan said, and document everything when it was found, what it means, why the original 3-stage verification matters. I want the audit trail to be complete. Should I tell Victoria? I'll tell Victoria, he said. Tonight. He called her at 8:30. She answered on the second ring, which told him she was still working. He walked her through what Priya had found. Victoria listened without interrupting. She'd gotten better at this over the last 2 days, Or maybe he was just better at reading the quality of her silence, which had turned out to be substantial and various. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 3 separate failure points, she said. Compounding, yes. And none of them were connected to each other's decisions. That's what the timestamps suggest. She exhaled, not a visible exhale, an audible one. The sound of someone integrating something that is worse than what they thought. How does that happen? How do 3 separate people each make a decision that makes the system less safe and nobody? She stopped. They all believed it was someone else's job to catch it, she said. That's my read, Ethan said. When you structure a project so that senior leadership controls the approval process and individual engineers operate in siloed tracks, you create exactly the conditions where this can happen. Everyone optimizes their piece. Nobody owns the whole. You own the whole. I designed the whole. There's a difference. He paused. When I was here the first time, I owned the whole because the project was structured around the design. When I left, the structure changed. Victor owned the outcomes. Dale owned the engineering execution. Other people owned individual subsystems. Nobody owned the thing itself. The line was quiet. I need you to put that in writing, Victoria said. What you just said. The organizational analysis. Not for the board, for me. Because if we rebuild this system and don't rebuild how the organization thinks about it, we're going to end up in the same place in 3 years. I can do that. Ethan. Her voice shifted slightly, not softer. More direct, which from Victoria was its own kind of softness. I need to ask you something. Ask? When you found out what had been done to the system to the full extent of it, the 3 separate failure points, all of it, you spent 3 years positioning yourself to stop it from causing harm. You didn't take it public. You didn't try to burn the company down. You just... She paused. You stayed and you fixed things from where you were. He waited. Why? She said. And I'm not asking for the practical answer about Lily or the NDA. I know those answers. I'm asking what made you decide that the machine was worth saving, that we were worth saving. He sat with the question for a moment. It was a genuine question. He could hear that. Because the machine works, he said finally. The original design, what I built before it got modified, works. Titan Rescue X, built the way it was designed to be built, can do exactly what it says it can do. It can go into a collapsed structure and bring people out alive. He paused. That thing doesn't stop being real because of what Victor did to the documentation. It doesn't stop being possible because of what Dale did to the firmware. The potential in the design isn't changed by the people who mishandled it. It just needs to be gotten back to. He could hear her breathing. I've spent my career making things work, he said. That's what I know how to do. Walking away from something because someone else damaged it has never made sense to me. A pause. And I guess I believe that somewhere in this company, behind all the decisions that went wrong, there were still people who originally wanted to build something that mattered. I just had to wait until the circumstances let me show them what they'd actually built. Silence on the line. Get some sleep, Victoria said finally. Her voice was quieter than he'd heard it. You too, he said. He hung up and sat at his desk in the empty engineering bay at 8:45 at night, with the original design schematics spread across 2 monitors and Priya's firmware comparison still open on a third, and the familiar hum of the facility lights above him, and the particular feeling of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly the thing he was built to do. He packed up at 9. He drove home. He came through the door at 9:30 to find Patricia and Lily at the kitchen table again. Lily in her pajamas. Patricia with tea. Both of them mid-conversation about something that stopped when he came in. Lily looked up. You look tired, she said. I am, he said. But okay, tired, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at his daughter. He thought about everything that had happened in the 41 hours since Victoria had thrown a manual at his chest. He thought about what he'd told Victoria on the phone 8 minutes ago. I believed that somewhere in this company, there were still people who originally wanted to build something that mattered. He thought about Lily, who had always believed her father was building something that mattered, even when the world he went to every day didn't know his name. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, tired." She slid off her chair and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from the side, which was her version of a hug, not face to face, but next to him, committed to the same direction. He put his arm around her shoulders. "Grandma made soup," she said. "Soup sounds exactly right," he said. He sat down and Patricia served him soup without being asked, and Lily told him about her day at school, which involved a disagreement about whose turn it was at the water fountain that had apparently been resolved through a coin flip. And outside the window, the night was dark and quiet, and the house was warm, and Ethan Walker ate his soup and listened to his daughter, and was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely present in exactly the life he had. The 90 days didn't feel like 90 days. That was the thing about work that has genuine purpose behind it. It compresses time differently than work that doesn't. Ethan had spent 3 years doing necessary work that felt like every hour of every hour, because there is a specific weight to doing important things in a context where nobody understands they're important. But these 90 days moved the way focused work moves when the people around you are pulling in the same direction and the thing you're building has a real destination. Day 3. The suspension joint rehabilitation team completed the mechanical recalibration and reinstalled the original monitoring protocol. Ethan ran the resonance diagnostics himself, standing at the control terminal at 6 in the morning, with the facility still mostly empty, and watched the readings settle into exactly the range the original design called for. He stood there for an extra 30 seconds after the numbers confirmed it, not celebrating, just verifying, making sure what he was seeing was real. Day 11. Priya's team finished the 3-stage firmware verification restoration. They ran it through 400 simulated failure scenarios, electromagnetic interference events, sensor misreads, communication interruptions at various stages of a rescue operation. The 3-stage verification caught every single one. Not one false shutdown. Ethan signed off on the firmware at 9:30 p.m. on a Thursday and texted Priya one word: "Good." She texted back, too, "Thank you." He understood that she wasn't thanking him for the compliment. She was thanking him for the chance to fix it. Day 34. The navigation algorithm team hit a wall. Ethan had expected this. The algorithm rebuild was the most complex of the 3 work streams, because it wasn't just restoring something, it was rebuilding something that had been modified in a way that was subtly wrong rather than obviously broken, which is the hardest kind of problem to resolve, because there's no clear boundary between what to keep and what to replace. The team had been working from his original specifications, but the debris field modeling that the algorithm relied on had itself been updated over the years with new data, and integrating the original safety logic with the updated modeling data was not straightforward. He spent 3 days in that team's workspace, which meant he was rotating between 3 teams across 3 buildings and averaging about 5 hours of sleep, and Patricia had started leaving extra coffee in his travel mug in the evenings, so he'd have it ready in the morning without having to make it. He never asked her to do this. She just did it because Patricia understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is remove one small obstacle from their path without making a production of it. On the 37th day, Priya, who had migrated from the firmware team to assist with the algorithm problem because the teams had started collaborating organically in the way good teams do when the work is hard enough, found the integration approach. It was elegant, which Ethan appreciated, because elegance in engineering is not an aesthetic preference. It's a reliability signal. Simple solutions fail in simple ways. She walked him through it at 7 in the morning on a whiteboard, talking fast the way she did when she was excited about something, and he stood with his arms crossed and asked 3 questions and then said, "Build it." She built it. The algorithm was complete and validated on day 51. That left 39 days for integrated system testing running Titan Rescue X through the full range of deployment scenarios with all 3 restored systems working together as a unified architecture, the way Ethan had originally designed them to work. This was the part of the process he'd been most focused on, not because the component work was less important, but because integration is where engineering designs either prove themselves or reveal the gaps that component testing doesn't show. The first integrated test happened on day 54. Victoria was there. She'd been present for several of the milestone moments throughout the 90 days, never hovering, never inserting herself into the technical process, but present in a way that communicated to everyone in the room that this work mattered to the leadership of the company in a way that was different from how things had mattered before. Ethan noticed what this did to the team, not immediate and not dramatic, but cumulative. People work differently when they believe the organization around them is actually watching in good faith. The first integrated test ran for 40 minutes. Titan Rescue X navigated a simulated debris field, identified 3 target locations representing trapped civilians, executed approach sequences, and completed extractions. The tertiary suspension joint held through load conditions that exceeded the demonstration day failure threshold. The navigation algorithm routed correctly through a debris configuration specifically designed to trigger the previous failure mode. The firmware verification caught a simulated command error at the 17-minute mark and handled it cleanly. The machine worked. Not perfectly. There were 2 calibration adjustments needed in the approach sequence and 1 sensor response time that ran slightly outside spec. Ethan noted them, assigned them, had them corrected by end of day. But it worked. He stood on the test floor afterward while the team around him was doing the things teams do when something they've been working on finally works. Talking faster than usual, shaking hands. Someone laughing at something that wasn't quite that funny, but was funny enough given the context. And he put his hand on the lateral arm, housing the same way he'd put it on the machine in the dark at 5 in the morning, 90-some days ago. The vibration was gone. There was only the clean, level hum of a system running exactly the way it was designed to run. He stood there with his palm flat on the metal for a long moment. Then he took his hand away and went back to work, because there were still 36 days and a federal certification process ahead of him. And satisfaction is something you're allowed to feel briefly and then redirect. The legal proceedings against Victor Hale had been moving on a parallel track through all of it, in the way that institutional and legal processes move present in the background, significant in their implications, occasionally surfacing in ways that required Ethan's attention. He had provided testimony to the company's legal team in week 2. A sworn declaration about the original design process, the timeline of the project, the specific modifications he'd identified, and their engineering significance. He'd been careful and precise, and complete, the same way he was careful and precise, and complete in engineering documentation, because the standard for accuracy in one shouldn't be different from the other. He'd also spoken briefly with the federal investigators who had gotten involved once Richard Farrow's office had formally flagged the safety violations to the appropriate regulatory bodies. That conversation had happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 investigators in a small conference room, and it had lasted 3 hours and covered every aspect of what he'd observed and documented over 3 years. He'd brought copies of everything. The investigators had been thorough. They'd asked good questions, the kind that showed they'd already done significant work before sitting down with him. He didn't know exactly what Victor was facing. That wasn't his domain. What he knew was that the documentation was complete, the evidence was solid, and the people whose job it was to determine consequences were doing their job. He'd done his part. He'd made sure the truth was findable and readable and impossible to dismiss. What happened next belonged to a different set of hands. Dale Hutchins had resigned during week 3. Not fired, resigned, which was its own statement about what people do when they understand that what's coming is worse than leaving. Ethan had no particular feeling about this. Dale had made choices that could have killed people. The professional consequence of those choices wasn't something Ethan tracked with either satisfaction or sympathy. It was simply an outcome the way outcomes are. On day 88, Richard Farrow returned to the Vanguard facility, not for a demonstration, for a review. He brought 2 engineers from his office and Dr. Simmons, who had maintained her consulting role through the rebuild period, and they spent 6 hours with the system and with Ethan's team and with the documentation. Ethan walked them through everything. The original design specifications, the 3 failure points that had been identified, and the specific engineering rationale for the restoration approach. The integrated test data from day 54 through day 82, a progression of results that showed not just that the system was working, but that it was working consistently and under increasingly demanding conditions. Farrow asked precise questions. His engineers asked more technical ones. Dr. Simmons asked the ones that went underneath the technical layer to the assumptions the design was built on, which were the most important questions, and Ethan answered every single one of them directly. At 4 p.m. on day 88, Farrow said, "I'd like to see it run." They ran it. The test lasted 52 minutes. Full deployment scenario, maximum debris. Complexity, 3 simulated extractions. 2 deliberate fault injections to test the emergency response systems. Titan Rescue X completed every sequence. The fault injections were caught and managed cleanly. The system powered down at the end of the test run with the orderly, settled quality of a machine that is doing what it was designed to do and knows it. Farrow stood at the edge of the test floor and watched the machine come to rest. He was quiet for a long moment. "This is different from what we saw in December," he said. He wasn't talking about the obvious. He was talking about something underneath the technical performance, the quality of the thing itself. The sense that what was running in front of him was what it claimed to be. "It's the same machine," Ethan said. "It just has its original design back." Farrow looked at him, and then he said what he'd come here to say, which was, "We'll issue the certification." 2 words that meant the federal contract held. 2 words that meant Titan Rescue X would be deployed. 2 words that were the endpoint of 90 days of work and 5 years of everything before that. Ethan nodded. "Thank you," he said. That was all. Not because he was holding back, because that was exactly the right amount to say. Victoria held the formal company ceremony on day 93. Not a press event, not an investor presentation. An all-hands meeting in the main facility floor, the largest space in the building, with the entire company present. 412 employees. The engineering team in the front. Maintenance and facilities staff alongside them, which was Victoria's explicit instruction, and Ethan noticed it and understood what it meant. She spoke for 12 minutes. He'd expected something polished and strategic, because that was what he'd understood about Victoria Sterling over the years, before he knew her, that she was the woman who always knew what the room needed to hear, and gave it to them efficiently. But what she said wasn't efficient. It was honest, which is sometimes the slower thing. She talked about what had gone wrong. Not in vague institutional language, not in the euphemisms that organizations use when they're describing failures they'd rather not fully claim. She said specifically what had happened, that engineering credit had been stolen, that safety systems had been modified by people with authority over them and without accountability for the consequences, that a man who had built the foundation of the company's most important product had been removed from that product and placed in a role where his knowledge was invisible, and that the culture she'd presided over had made all of this possible. She said, "I told myself I was running a merit-based organization. What I was actually running was an organization that rewarded the appearance of merit without checking whether the appearance matched the reality. And the cost of that difference was paid by people who deserved better from us." The room was very quiet. "We're not holding this ceremony to celebrate recovering from a failure," she said. "We're holding it because the person who is most responsible for this company still existing and this product being what it should be deserves to have his name said out loud in this building in front of every person who works here." She picked up a book from the table beside her. It was the new manual. The final certified design document for Titan Rescue X, updated through the rebuild and printed for distribution to the federal deployment teams. Ethan hadn't seen the final version yet. Victoria had handled the printing personally and kept it from him deliberately, which he'd found mildly irritating at the time, and now understood was intentional. She held it up. "The cover of this document," she said, "reads exactly what it should have read from the beginning." She turned it to face the room. Created by Ethan J. Walker. 412 people read those 6 words. The applause started in the back, in the maintenance and facilities section, and it moved forward through the room in a wave that Ethan felt physically, not the sound of it, but the weight of it. the collective acknowledgement of 400 people who had come to understand over the last 90 days what that name represented and what it had taken to put it back where it belonged. He was standing at the front of the room, and he felt the applause hit him, and he stood straight and received it, and did not look away, because a man who has spent 5 years being invisible is allowed to be seen for the time it takes 400 people to tell him they see him. Then it faded, and Victoria walked to him and held out the manual. He took it. He looked at the cover, at his name, at the 6 words that had existed on the inside page of the original document that she had thrown at him 93 days ago, that had stopped a room full of important people, that had started everything that followed. The same words, in the same font, in the right place now. "Thank you," he said to her quietly. She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said back. The reception afterward was full of people who wanted to talk to him, shake his hand, tell him things. He was patient with all of it, and genuine, because these were people who were trying to do right by a thing that had gone wrong and that deserves patience and genuineness even when you're tired. Priya found him near the edge of the room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "What happens now?" she asked. It wasn't anxious, just curious, the way an engineer asks about the next problem. "The deployment teams start training on the system next week," he said. "The first operational units go to 3 cities: Chicago, Houston, Seattle. Pharaoh's office is coordinating the rollout. And the team here stays on. There'll be field data coming back from the deployments. Refinements to make. Things we didn't anticipate that only show up when the machine is in actual conditions." He looked at her. "That's the part that never ends. And it's also the part that matters most." Priya nodded slowly. "I want to be on that part," she said. "The field data analysis. The refinements." "I know you do," he said. "You're already on it." She looked at him for a second, like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. Then she nodded, once the decisive nod of someone filing something important, and went back into the crowd. He drove home that evening at 7:15, earlier than he'd managed on most nights in the last 3 months. The light was still in the sky, that long summer evening light that comes in through car windows at an angle and reminds you what season it is in a way that the inside of a building never does. Patricia had made dinner, the real kind, not the leave-it-in-the-oven kind, the kind that means she'd planned ahead and wanted to mark the occasion, which was her way of marking occasions through food and presents rather than ceremony. Lily was at the table when he came in. She'd been told something about today, though Ethan hadn't given Patricia the details. Enough that she knew it was significant. She was dressed slightly better than usual for a Wednesday evening, which on a 9-year-old meant her shirt was tucked in and she'd brushed her hair, and the rabbit was notably absent, which meant this was being categorized as a grown-up event. She looked at him when he came in and did the thing she'd done since she was small, the immediate, uncomplicated assessment of whether he was okay, the way children read the adults they love, with a precision that no professional training produces. "You look different," she said. Different how? She thought about it. "Like when you're done with something," she said. "Like when you finish fixing the sink and it works, and you put the tools away." He looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old, and had just described 5 years of his life in 12 words with more accuracy than anything he'd managed to put together himself. "Yeah," he said, "like that." "Is it actually done?" she asked. "Or is it the kind of done where there's more later?" "There's always more later," he said. "But the thing that needed to be fixed is fixed." She considered this with the same focused seriousness she'd applied to every conversation they'd had about this over 5 years, the careful, loyal attention of a child who took her father's work seriously, because she had always understood at some level beneath the words that it mattered. "Are people seeing you now?" she asked. It was what she'd asked him 93 days ago on the evening he came home late, and she was at the kitchen table with her rabbit and the warm milk. He'd told her he was always here, that they'd just finally looked. He thought about Pharaoh standing at the edge of the test floor, saying, "This is different." He thought about Priya saying, "I want to be on that part." He thought about 400 people reading 6 words on a book cover, and the weight of the applause moving forward through the room. He thought about a manual thrown across a demonstration room, hitting his chest, and his hands opening the cover, and a name that had waited 5 years to be read by the right people, in the right light. He looked at his daughter. "Yes," he said. "They're seeing me now." Lily nodded, satisfied in the complete, uncomplicated way that only children and people who have been right about something for a very long time can be satisfied. "Good," she said. "I was tired of being the only one." Patricia called them to dinner. They sat down, the three of them, at the same table, where they'd sat through 5 years of ordinary evenings that had held beneath their ordinariness the full weight of everything Ethan was carrying. The same table where he'd packed his lunch at 4:40 in the morning and answered his daughter's question about why he went somewhere every day where people weren't kind to him. The same table where he'd come home tired in all the different ways a person can be tired and eaten the food that was waiting for him and let the warmth of the house do what warmth does. He looked at the table, and he looked at the people at it, and he felt the fullness of the moment, without needing to name it, because some things don't require naming to be completely real. Across the city in the Vanguard Robotics facility, Titan Rescue X stood powered down and ready in the deployment bay, its systems clean and calibrated, its safety architecture intact. Its name on the documentation truthful and complete. Somewhere in a federal processing system, 3 cities were preparing to receive the machines that would stand by, ready to enter the places where buildings fall and people are trapped. And minutes are the unit of measurement that determines whether someone goes home. And the man who built the thing that made that possible was eating dinner with his daughter, listening to her explain the water fountain disagreement resolution system with the gravity it deserved, and was exactly, completely, entirely where he was supposed to be. Some names get erased. Some get buried under revision logs and false reports and the accumulated weight of other people's ambition. Some get carried for years by the person they belong to in the patient certainty that the truth doesn't require witnesses to remain true. But the names that are written into the things that matter, into the systems that save lives, into the work that holds up under pressure, into the designs that function exactly as intended. When it counts, those names don't disappear. They wait. And when the right moment comes, when someone finally opens the cover and looks at what's actually written there, they are found exactly where they were always placed, exactly where they belong.